Welcome to Advanced Watercoloring Portraiture Part 2. In this lesson, we will be working on lighting, working on middle ground painting with natural sponges, and we'll be discussing layering techniques. Okay, we're going to zoom in a little bit so you can see what the pencil outline looks like on the paper of the drawing here. And as you can see, we're coming at this after I've already placed the purple watercolor onto the paper here. So I'm going to show you the same technique I used for the purple watercolor I'm going to use for the green. One thing I'll say before we go there is look at the easel that we have set up here, whatever you're using. What I definitely encourage you to do is take the watercolor piece of paper that you purchase. If you're lucky and you're working on a size that's smaller than your water paper, than the watercolor that you purchase, you can cut off pieces of it and make scraps. And I encourage you to do scraps right next to your artwork so that you can test colors. And that way you don't just jump right in and start painting with whatever color you have and find out halfway through it that you have a color that you don't like. So always put these little test pieces on the side. You see here I've already done some color tests with purple, found I didn't like a couple. Do the same thing with yours. Once you have that in place, you can also take notes or what have you. Okay. So, I've mixed up a little bit of green watercolor here. Nothing really special. Just a standard old green that comes out of the kit. I initially put some yellow in there, mixed it up, and just really didn't feel good about it. And all we're doing here is just going to mix it up into whatever you're using for your palette. You can have a paper palette, you have one of those plastic palettes, or if you have something more advanced, that's fine. I'm just going to use these little styrofoam plates because my palette is currently busy on a different project. So these are some little plates. And basically it's just a puddle of water. I want to keep it really thin. I'm keeping it thin, and instead of trying to add white to the paint, which comes in most watercolor kits, you can add white, but what that'll do is that'll mute your color and make it more of a pastel, and I'm really wanting the brilliance of the paper to come out. So we just mix a little water into that, and then we use basically a natural sponge like this here. You can get it at most art stores, and the sponge will pull up the colors, but it's going to leave a very light amount, so we'll never touch the heavy stuff. And then we'll put a couple of layers and add some real nice texture to that. Okay, so I'm just going to try out a few little dabs here on the scratch paper that I have to see if this is the color I'm going to want. If it's too thin, I can go back and add a little more color in there. If the color's not what I want, then I'll add in some yellows or some blues. But it so happens I already did a color test on this. I did a yellow mix earlier. It became too lime green, so I decided not to use that. And now I can work with the color that I prefer around the canvas without having problems. Excuse me, in order to use the natural sponge that you have, all you want to do is dab. Okay, you come in here, you choose the areas that you want to add a little color to, and it's fun to have the weight of the watercolor showing. It kind of puddles a little bit in some spots. Don't let it puddle too much, but it'll give you a little texture to what you're trying to accomplish. And with just a little bit of work, you'll end up having a nice natural looking experience for your pattern. So I'm kind of going for a floral pattern on this quilt, which happens to have a mixture of floral patterns and other types of textures. And I'm just going to keep it simple in this portrait, and I'm just going to do a mixture of purples and greens, a couple of layers to get some texture in there, something that's just pleasant and will help to envelope the portrait very nicely. Kind of think of it as the purples and greens that you might see with flowers, it's essentially, well, not flowers, but like violets. I'm actually going to leave some of the white peeking through because there is a white background to the portrait, or to the quilt. So I'm going to leave that in there. And I may come back later with specifically some white, because the white will be a little bit brighter than the paper, to fill that out. And the good thing about sponges is that you have large edges, you also have small edges which you can use to get right up next to the figure You don't have to worry too much about swapping brushes and that sort of stuff, because the sponge can be buried back and forth. There's some up around her hair here. Not to let it dominate too much, because we're going to come back with natural hair colors. But you definitely want to run the colors of your background material, if you have a quilt or something that they're on, or a towel or whatever that you're trying to paint in there, right up to the edge of the subject. Make sure that you don't have a bunch of white halo stuff going around the subject, because then it won't look finished. This here is what it looks like with just one layer of green. I'm going to let that dry and come back with a secondary layer, and you'll see some nice texturing. In fact, if you look here in the purple layers, you can see where I came back with at least one or two other layers of violet color in there. We're going to do the same thing with the green. Let's talk a little bit about lighting just a moment, because we're going to start adding some shading to the quilt. So when I shot this, I actually had two lights, one on the left hand side and one on the right hand side, that are just some white, nice ambient lights, and it casts light in both directions. I didn't get real strong with it because I wanted a nice, smoothly lit watercolor. Normally you'll pick a direction for light, and I would say at this point the strongest shadow direction we have is casting from left to right. So that'll help you when you're putting in your shading for the figures as well as for the quilt to a degree. You can tell because there's a little bit of shading right around the model's neck. There's some shading on her face here. Under the arms, you can see the shading there, as well as the shading that the baby casts across the lap. And then you have some nice whiteness here right in front. That's where the brighter light's coming from this side. So, but overall, we're going to direct our painting the same way the photograph has, which is light coming from the right. It's sort of the key light coming right from the top right to the top left to the bottom right, and with just a little secondary light coming in from the right side. That'll help us not only in laying out their shadows, but also give us a rough sense of where the lighting should go for the quilt. So if you can look up under here, you see some shading around the knees, some darkness in this little fold here where the arm of the chair that she's sitting in comes in, some shading behind her where she's hits in front of the quilt. Same thing's true back here, and then we're going to hit some of these folds in the painting as well to help give that texture some solidarity. Here we're using a fine tip brush to add some blue-violet flowers to the quilt. It'll add a different texture than the sponge will, and we'll also use the blue-violet later on in the background to create an overall consistent feel. The next thing we're going to do then is take a really light wash of black. So this is just a black wash, and super light mix of paint, not a whole lot. I normally like to use blues for shading on white items, but since we have so much blue and purple in this particular painting, I didn't want to risk it getting washed into those colors. So we're using a super light gray mix here. And again, I just went over here a second ago and just tested the darkness of that to see if I liked, how dark it was, and it's looking pretty good. So then we're going to come in here in the pencil tracing that we did earlier. You'll recall that there was some tracing of the folds of the quilt. So we're going to go into those folds now and just start building up the weight of those folds to help them stand out against the pattern. And notice I painted the pattern before the folds. Now if you want to go back later and paint some more pattern, you can do so because this stuff is translucent. But my goal was to lay that pattern down first because the shading will sit on top of the pattern, or the light shading would actually sit on top of the lighting pattern in the photo, for example, or in real life. So So we're just going to come in here and slowly build these shadows up. Got here, at least the beginnings of. It's not perfect yet, but we have a sense of weight. She's coming in, the folds of the couch are sort of wrapping around her. They're also wrapping around the folds of the quilt are wrapping around her. They're also wrapping around the surface of this chair. We come down, here's the arm. The surface of the chair extends out past where she has her legs, and then we're starting to drop in some shadow here to impress upon the viewer that we're getting some weight from her as she squeezes into that quilt. And this isn't quite dark enough yet down here, but I'm going to hold off on laying in the heavy darks until we have all the light stuff laid out and all the colors pretty much where we want them to be.